Today we're going to be discussing Hi, welcome to another episode of The Gab. I'm your host, Gabby Lundy. Today we're going to be discussing Latinx representation. And I use the word Latinx because it's a little bit more gender inclusive than Latino, Latina, Latinos. Um, so check on my history terms blog post for a little bit more information about that. And in an American media context, Latinx are usually seen as Mexican, Mexican American, Cuban, Cuban American, because those are really the closest Latin Hispanic nations to us, and that we see the most immigration from in America. And I think that reflects kind of on what we see on TV as well because of that. And for the historical background for Latinx representation in American media, I'm taking most of this from NPR. And NPR had a series called Two Languages, Many Voices, Latinos on TV. And so this historical background is going to go from about the 1950s to the early 2000s before I go into the present day. So one of the very first representations of Latinx people on TV was on I Love Lucy. I Love Lucy ran between 1951 and 1957, and one of the main characters on I Love Lucy was Ricky Ricardo. Ricky Ricardo was a regular, if I'm not mistaken, Lucy's husband, and he was played by a Cuban. The next really big main representation we saw was really not until the 1970s with a show which was the first bilingual sitcom on TV called Que Pasa USA. And this was a multi-generational Cuban American family dealing with having their Cuban roots, but also dealing with adapting to America. And this is interesting because it was a local television, like a local public television show that was federally funded, kind of like it was funded for the Miami area where a lot of Cuban Americans resided. One of the next things that NPR lists as Latinx representation historically is from 1983, and it's a TV show called Condo. And Condo didn't last very long, and Condo was very interesting because it showed a very upper middle class Hispanic family directly alongside a white middle class family and kind of their interactions and seeing them very much so as equals. The next big thing we see is Saved by the Bell in the 1990s with Mario Lopez. Mario Lopez's character was very Americanized. He wasn't a foreigner, he wasn't an immigrant, maybe the child of immigrants, but it doesn't really go into it until I think Saved by the Bell, the college years, where they kind of ask his character to get back to his roots. So that show, even though it had Mario Lopez in it, his character didn't really connect with his Hispanic heritage. And then we have in the late 1990s That 70s Show, which, if anyone has seen That 70s Show, has Fez. And the actor who plays Fez is of Colombian and Venezuelan descent, um, but the character of Fez doesn't really have a nationality per se. He is just the foreign exchange student, heavy accent, heavy stereotypes of a foreigner. Um, you never know where he's from. That's part of the running joke. Most of his mannerisms and his lack of knowledge in American customs and behaviors and mannerisms is kind of the running joke as well. So I personally wouldn't put that as a good representation. And after That 70s Show, what we see is the George Lopez Show. And the George Lopez Show started in the 2000s. And the really interesting thing about the George Lopez Show is its star, George Lopez, because he was a comedian before this show. He was the co-founder, producer, and star of this show, which is really important because it's important for people to also have background roles in creating media, and I think that's why the George Lopez show was so successful. Um, George Lopez went on to be the first Hispanic person to have a late night TV show as well. And the George Lopez show was really popular. And so, as for modern context, what we see are shows like Modern Family, Dora the Explorer, and Handy Mandy, just off the top of my head. And Modern Family has Sofia Vergara's character as very heavy accented Colombian woman who immigrated to America. Um, she has a thick accent, which is really cool, but she also falls into a lot of stereotypes as well. She has been known to say that she is very proud of that. She likes that. She feels that that personally represents the women she knows and loves, and like her family and things like that. But critics of that interpretation, due to the writing and her interpretation of that, say that that's also a very stereotypical role of the hot-tempered Latina um, stereotype. And then we have shows like Dora the Explorer and Handy Mandy, where they're just kids that are bilingual of Hispanic descent who are trying to teach other little kids Spanish and English. And I don't really know a lot about those shows and how their representation is because I haven't watched Dora the Explorer in so long. Um, but Dora doesn't have a job. She's seen as a kid who just kind of runs around and has adventures. And Handy Mandy is a construction worker, so kind of like a mix between Dora the Explorer and Bob the Builder. And with those historical and present stereotyped characters, we're going to talk about the actual impacts that seeing those characters on TV has on Latinx self-esteem, self perception, and also outsiders' views on Latinx people. So besides the Latin lover, other Latinx stereotypes we see are the criminal, the law enforcer, the harlot, and the buffoon. And all of those can create misrepresentations of what Latinx people are like in real life. And it's especially problematic because there's not a lot of Latinx people on TV anyway. According to a study in 2005, the population of Latinx people in America was 12.5% of the total population. As for TV representation, 1 to 3% of the total TV representation on primetime television. That's a problem because people start to generate ideas of what the actual population amounts are and who they are based on what we see on TV, and that comes from cultivation theory and social identity theory. Cultivation theory says that long-term exposure to TV influences what we think the real world is like based on what we've seen on TV. So that leads to two things. One, people believing in stereotypes. And two, people believing the demographic population numbers. And so that is where we get people who watch a lot of TV thinking that the real world is like what it looks like on TV. And social identity theory is having the exposure to both the quantity and the quality of TV messages and how that impacts the real world interracial interactions. So the findings from the study in 2005 state that even though there's sort of this upward trend for Latinx representation, it's still mostly based on these stereotypical representations, and the numbers still aren't there in terms of trying to match up with the current population of the United States. And so from these two theories, what we can learn is that people are going to think that there are less Latinx people in America than there really are. By there are 4 times more Latinx people in America than what's perceived on TV. And the quality of these representations, people are going to take these stereotypes that they see on TV, all of these caricatures of what Latinx people are on TV, and so non-Latinx people will project these stereotypes onto Latinx people, and that's going to affect their interracial interactions. Another thing that this study found is that Latinx men greatly outnumber Latinx women on TV. And that's just part of the greater problem of men outnumbering women on TV and it not reflecting in real life demographics either. So all of these interactions are going to be tainted by the representations that we see of Latinx people on TV. So what can we do about it? We need to seek out and demand more diverse Latinx characters that are more well-rounded and fit other identities and don't fall into these stereotype traps. Because Latinx people are a variety of different people. There are millions of Latinx people around the world and just alone in the United States. You can't tell me that they fit into these, what, six stereotypes? I don't buy it, and you shouldn't either. That's all I have for you today on this episode of The Gap. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe so we can continue this conversation. Make sure to follow the blog in the description below. What I want to know from you today is, what is the best Latinx representation you've seen? What is your favorite, most well rounded character that's Latinx? And remember, you as the audience have power.